The morning sun barely touched the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey when the world began holding its breath. Television crews from every corner of the globe positioned their cameras along the historic streets of London. Millions of people were already gathering behind barriers, wrapped in flags and excitement. Inside the palace walls, however, a very different scene was unfolding. William stood before the tall mirror in his private chamber, his ceremonial robes feeling heavier than he remembered from the rehearsals. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the collar. Today was not just another day in his life. Today he would become king. But his mind was not on crowns or thrones. His thoughts kept drifting to the small bedroom down the hallway where his children were getting ready. Catherine entered the room quietly, her elegant gown flowing behind her like morning mist. She saw the worry in her husband's eyes immediately. After all these years together, she could read his thoughts without words. She walked over and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "They will be fine," she said softly, though her own voice carried a hint of concern. William turned to face her, his eyes reflecting both pride and fear. "George is only 10 years old, Catherine. Charlotte is 8. Louis is just 5. The whole world will be watching them. Every camera, every eye, every judgment." Catherine smiled, that same warm smile that had steadied him through countless moments of doubt over the years. "They are stronger than you think. They have your heart and your courage." Down the corridor, the children's rooms buzzed with activity. George sat on the edge of his bed, his small ceremonial uniform laid out beside him. He stared at the formal clothes with wide eyes. His nanny had explained everything he needed to do today, but the weight of it all pressed down on his young shoulders. Charlotte burst into his room without knocking, as she always did. Her dress was already on, a beautiful creation of lace and silk that made her look like a princess from a storybook. But her face showed nervousness, not excitement. "George, I'm scared," she whispered, sitting down next to her older brother. George wanted to tell her he was scared too. He wanted to say that his stomach felt like it was full of flying birds and his hands were sweating. But he was the oldest. He had to be brave. "We just have to walk slowly and stand quietly," he said, trying to sound confident. "Father told me that's all we have to do." "But what if I trip? What if my dress gets caught? What if I sneeze during the important part?" Charlotte's questions tumbled out one after another. Before George could answer, little Louis appeared in the doorway, dragging his favorite stuffed lion. He was already dressed in his miniature suit, but he had somehow managed to get chocolate on his collar. "Why is everyone so serious?" Louis asked, climbing onto the bed between his siblings. "Father said today is a special celebration." Charlotte and George exchanged glances. Louis was too young to fully understand the enormous responsibility their father was about to accept. He did not yet grasp that their lives were about to change forever. In another wing of the palace, William's father sat alone in his study. The former king, now stepping aside for his son, held an old photograph in his weathered hands. It showed a young William, barely older than George was now, standing beside his own mother. The weight of memory pressed heavy on his chest. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. William entered, still in his ceremonial robes, looking every bit the king he was about to become. "I thought I might find you here," William said gently. His father looked up, and for a moment, William saw something unexpected in those familiar eyes. Tears. His father was crying. "I remember when I wore those robes," the older man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember thinking I was not ready. I remember wishing my own mother could see me." William sat down beside his father, the heavy robes settling around him. "I wish she could see this day too," he said quietly. "She would be so proud of you, more than you know." His father reached over and gripped William's hand tightly. "And she would be most proud of the father you have become." Those words struck William's heart like an arrow. He thought of George trying to be brave, of Charlotte worrying about every small detail, of Louis still innocent enough to see only celebration. They were children, his children, and today he was bringing them into a storm of public attention that would never fully disappear. "Am I doing the right thing?" William asked, voicing the doubt that had haunted him for weeks. "Letting them be part of the ceremony? Exposing them to all those cameras, all that pressure?" His father was quiet for a long moment, still holding that old photograph. "Your mother once told me something I have never forgotten. She said that love shown in public touches more hearts than love hidden away." Your children, William, are your greatest strength. Letting the world see your family, see your love for them, that is not weakness. That is the most powerful thing a king can do. Back in the children's wing, Catherine had gathered all three children together. She knelt down to their level, her beautiful gown pooling around her on the floor. She looked at each of their faces, seeing the fear and confusion mixed with excitement. "I want to tell you something very important," she said, taking George's hand and Charlotte's hand in hers. Louis climbed into her lap. "Today your father is accepting a very big responsibility. But you know what the most important part of today is?" The children shook their heads. "The most important part is that we are together. We are a family. No matter how many people are watching, no matter how many cameras flash, no matter how big and important everything seems, we have each other. Can you remember that?" "Will people be mean about us?" Charlotte asked in a small voice. "Will they say bad things like they do on the internet?" Catherine's heart broke a little at her daughter's awareness. At only 8 years old, Charlotte already knew that being in the royal family meant being criticized, judged, and examined by millions. "Some people might say unkind things," Catherine answered honestly, "but for every person who judges, there will be thousands who see your father's love for you. They will see a family, not just a king, and that love, my darling, that love is stronger than any criticism." Outside the palace windows, the crowds continued to grow. People from every nation, every background, every walk of life lined the streets. They held their phones high, ready to capture every moment. But they were not just waiting for crowns and ceremony. They were waiting to see something real in a world that often felt very fake. They were waiting to see humanity in the midst of all the grandeur. Inside, William stood and embraced his father one final time. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," his father replied, his voice steadier now. "Thank you. Thank you for showing the world that kings are fathers first." The time was approaching. Soon the carriages would depart for Westminster Abbey. Soon the ceremony that had been planned for years would begin, and 3 small children would walk into history, hand in hand with their parents, showing the world that even in the most formal traditions, love remains the greatest power of all. The golden carriage waited in the palace courtyard, gleaming under the cloudy London sky. Horse guards stood at attention, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone. William could hear the distant roar of the crowds beyond the palace gates. The sound reminded him of ocean waves, constant and overwhelming. George walked beside his father toward the carriage, his small hand gripping William's larger one tightly. The boy's face was pale, but he kept his chin up, trying to mirror his father's composed expression. Behind them, Catherine held Charlotte's hand while Louis skipped along, still not fully grasping the magnitude of the moment. "Father," George whispered as they approached the carriage steps, "my heart is beating very fast." William stopped and knelt down, ignoring the dozen attendants waiting nearby. He looked his son directly in the eyes. "Mine too," he admitted. "Do you know why?" George shook his head. "Because we care. Because this matters. Being nervous means we understand how important this is." "That's good, George. That means we are taking it seriously." The simple words seemed to ease something in George's expression. He nodded and climbed into the carriage with newfound determination. Charlotte was not handling the pressure as well. Her hands were shaking as she gathered her dress to climb the steps. Catherine noticed and whispered something in her daughter's ear. Charlotte nodded, but tears were forming in the corners of her eyes. Louis, meanwhile, waved enthusiastically at every guard and attendant they passed. "Good morning. Good morning," he called out cheerfully. His innocent joy brought smiles to the faces of even the most serious palace staff. The carriage door closed, and suddenly they were sealed in together. The family of 5 in their own small world, separate from the chaos outside. Through the windows they could see crowds pressing against the barriers, phones and cameras raised high. The carriage began to move, and the sound hit them like a physical force. Thousands of voices cheering, screaming, calling out their names. Charlotte pressed closer to her mother. George sat up straighter, trying to be brave. Louis waved at every person they passed, delighted by all the attention. William watched his children carefully. This was the moment he had dreaded most. Not the ceremony itself, not the weight of the crown, but this exposure of his children to the unfiltered attention of millions. Catherine caught his eye and gave him a small, reassuring nod. They had discussed this moment countless times. They had prepared as much as any parent could. Now they could only trust that their children's strength would carry them through. "Look at all the flags. Louis said, his nose pressed against the window. There are so many colors. It was true. The crowd was a sea of national flags from around the world. British flags mixed with American, Canadian, Australian, and dozens of others. People had traveled from every continent to witness this moment. Why are they all here? Charlotte asked quietly, her nervousness making her curious. William considered how to answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old girl that she and her family represent something larger than themselves? How do you tell a child that millions of people invest their hopes and dreams in a family they will never meet? They are here because they believe in something, William finally said.
They believe in tradition, in continuity, in the idea that some things remain constant even when the world changes rapidly.
And they are here because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. But we are just a family, George said, speaking up for the first time since entering the carriage. William felt his throat tighten with emotion. Yes, he said. We are just a family. And that is exactly why they care so much, because they have families too. They understand love, worry, hope, and fear. When they see us, they see reflections of their own lives. The carriage turned onto the main ceremonial route, and the crowd noise increased dramatically. The horses maintained their steady pace, their training evident in their calm demeanor despite the chaos around them. Charlotte was trembling now, and not just from nerves. Mother, I need to use the bathroom, she whispered urgently. Every parent knows this moment. The worst possible timing. Catherine glanced at William, and they both knew there was nothing to be done. They were in a moving carriage in the middle of a ceremonial procession watched by billions. Sweetheart, can you hold it for just a little longer? Catherine asked gently. We will be at the Abbey soon. I don't know, Charlotte said, her voice rising in panic. I should have gone again before we left. William leaned forward. Charlotte, look at me. His daughter's teary eyes met his. You are stronger than you know. Take deep breaths. Think about something else. Tell me about your favorite book. It was a distraction technique, and Charlotte knew it. But she grabbed onto it like a lifeline. She began talking about her current favorite story. Her voice shaky at first, but growing steadier. George joined in, adding his own comments. Even Louis contributed his thoughts, though he had not read the book himself. The family conversation continued as the carriage rolled through London streets. To the crowds outside, they looked picture perfect, a royal family waving and smiling. Inside the carriage, they were just parents helping a nervous child through a difficult moment. A photographer in the crowd captured a particular moment. His camera focused on the carriage window just as William reached over and took Charlotte's hand. The image was slightly blurred, shot through glass and motion, but the gesture was clear. A father comforting his child. That photograph would later go viral, shared millions of times across social media. People would comment on the humanity they saw in that simple gesture. But in the moment, William was not thinking about cameras or public perception. He was only thinking about his daughter's trembling hand in his. Westminster Abbey came into view, its ancient spires reaching toward the clouded sky. The carriage began to slow. George sat up even straighter, preparing himself. Charlotte gripped her mother's hand tighter. Louis pressed his face against the window, excited to see the big church he had heard so much about. This is it, William said quietly. Catherine looked at her husband, the man who was about to become king and saw only the father worried about his children. They will be wonderful, she said. Because they are ours. The carriage stopped. Outside, they could hear the ceremonial announcements beginning. The crowd noise swelled even louder. Royal attendants moved into position to open the carriage door. William looked at each of his children one final time before they stepped out into history. George, trying so hard to be the responsible older brother. Charlotte, fighting through her fear and discomfort. Louis, still young enough to see only wonder in everything. I love you all, William said simply. Remember, we are together. No matter what happens out there, we are together. We love you too, Father, George replied, speaking for all his siblings. The carriage door opened and the sound of the world rushed in. Cheers, music, camera shutters clicking like rainfall. The family prepared to step out, each taking a deep breath. Catherine went first, emerging with the practiced grace of years in the public eye. Then the children one by one. George stepped out with careful dignity. Charlotte followed, her discomfort hidden behind a brave smile. Louis bounded out with unrehearsed enthusiasm that made the crowd laugh and cheer even louder. Finally, William emerged and the crowd erupted. But his eyes were not on the thousands of faces before him. His eyes were on his 3 children, standing on the ancient stones of Westminster, waiting for him to lead them inside. He took his position, Catherine beside him, the children forming a line. Together as a family, they began the walk toward the Abbey doors. Each step took them closer to the ceremony that would change everything. But in that moment, walking together with his family, William felt something unexpected. Not fear, not doubt, but strength. His children's presence did not weaken him. It empowered him. They were his reason for accepting this responsibility. They were his motivation to be the best king he could be. The Abbey doors loomed before them, ancient and massive. Beyond those doors, tradition and ceremony awaited. But walking through them together, William knew they could face anything. The world watched, holding its breath as the family disappeared inside Westminster Abbey. The interior of Westminster Abbey swallowed them in sacred silence. After the roar of the crowds outside, the sudden quiet felt almost shocking. Centuries of history pressed down from the vaulted ceilings. Every stone, every carved figure, every stained glass window whispered of kings and queens who had walked this same path. George's eyes went wide as he looked up at the soaring architecture. He had been here before for rehearsals, but somehow today everything looked different. More real, more permanent. Charlotte stayed close to her mother, still fighting the uncomfortable urgency she felt. Louis gazed around with open-mouthed wonder, temporarily speechless for once. Ahead of them, rows upon rows of dignitaries filled the ancient pews. World leaders, members of parliament, foreign royalty, religious figures from every faith. 2,000 of the most powerful people in the world had gathered to witness this moment, and every single one of them turned to watch as William and his family entered. The music swelled, a choir of voices that seemed to come from heaven itself. The sound vibrated through the stone floor, through their bodies, filling every empty space with beauty and power. A young woman in the 3rd row began to cry. She had traveled from Australia, camping outside the palace for 3 days to secure her spot in the viewing area outside. Through a charity lottery, she had won one of the few public tickets to the ceremony. Now, seeing the family walk past, seeing the children's nervous faces and William's steady presence, her tears flowed freely. She was not alone. Throughout the Abbey, people wiped their eyes. There was something about witnessing this moment in person, about being part of this living history, that touched something deep in the human heart. George walked with careful, measured steps exactly as he had practiced, but inside his mind raced. He could feel every eye on him. He could sense the weight of expectation pressing down. One wrong move, one stumble, and it would be replayed forever on television and internet. Charlotte focused on breathing, just breathing. Her mother's hand in hers was the only thing keeping her grounded. She counted her steps, trying to distract herself from her physical discomfort. 10 steps, 20 steps, 30 steps. The throne seemed so far away. Louis, walking between his siblings, suddenly did something no one expected. He waved. Not the practiced royal wave they had been taught, but a real, genuine, excited wave to someone he recognized in the crowd. A palace staff member's child who he played with sometimes. A ripple of warm laughter spread through the Abbey. The tension broke for just a moment. People smiled. The moment of humanity in the midst of such formal ceremony reminded everyone that these were real children, not just royal figures. William heard the laughter and glanced back to see Louis waving enthusiastically. For a split second he worried. Was this appropriate? Would people think his son was being disrespectful? But then he saw the faces of the people around them. They were not frowning or judging. They were smiling, genuinely smiling. Louis's innocent gesture had done what no amount of formal protocol could do. It had made the ceremony feel human. Catherine squeezed Charlotte's hand. "Almost there, darling," she whispered. "You are doing beautifully." They reached their designated positions. The children were guided to special seats that had been prepared for them, positioned where they could see everything, but also be slightly protected from the most intense attention. Palace staff had fought hard for this arrangement, understanding that the children needed some buffer from the overwhelming atmosphere. As George sat down, he realized his hands were shaking. He clasped them together tightly, trying to appear calm. Next to him, Charlotte shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Louis swung his legs, still taking in all the sights around him. The Archbishop stepped forward, his ceremonial robes flowing. The ancient words of the coronation ceremony began, phrases that had been spoken for hundreds of years. The language was formal, old-fashioned, heavy with meaning. William stood at the center of it all, listening to words that would bind him to his role for the rest of his life. But his attention kept drifting to where his children sat. He could see George trying so hard to maintain composure. He could see Charlotte's discomfort. He could see Louis starting to fidget as the long ceremony continued. In the television control room outside, producers watched dozens of camera feeds. Every angle of the ceremony was being captured, but they kept returning to the cameras focused on the children. They knew instinctively that these were the images that would resonate most with viewers. One producer, a mother of 3 herself, watched Charlotte's face on a monitor and immediately recognized the signs of a child in distress. "That little girl needs a bathroom," she muttered to her colleague. "Can we do anything?" The colleague asked. "No," the producer said sadly. "She just has to get through it." Around the world, millions watched on their screens. In homes, in pubs, in town squares where giant screens had been erected. People who would never meet the royal family felt connected to them through the shared experience of watching. In a small apartment in Japan, an elderly woman watched alone. She had followed William's life since he was born. She had cried when his mother died. She had celebrated when he married Catherine. And now, seeing him with his own children, she felt the circle of life continuing. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks. In a hospital in Brazil, patients gathered around a television in the common room. A young boy undergoing cancer treatment sat in his wheelchair, completely absorbed in watching George. The boy was also 10 years old. He also knew what it felt like to have the world watching, to have to be brave when you were scared. He felt a connection to that distant prince in a way he could not explain. In Canada, a school had organized a viewing party. Children sat on the floor watching the ceremony. When they saw Louis wave, the entire classroom erupted in cheers. Their teacher smiled, knowing that this moment would stay with them forever. Back in the Abbey, the ceremony continued its ancient progression. There were readings, prayers, oaths, and rituals. Each segment carried deep symbolic meaning, but for 3 young children it all blended together into one long stretch of sitting still and being watched. Charlotte whispered something to George. He leaned closer to hear, then nodded sympathetically. He understood his sister was struggling. He wished he could help her. But what could a 10-year-old boy do in the middle of Westminster Abbey during his father's coronation? The moment came for the actual crowning. The Archbishop lifted the crown, heavy with jewels and history. The entire Abbey seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment everything had been building toward. William knelt, his head bowed. The crown was placed upon his head. The weight of it settled onto his skull, a physical reminder of the burden he was accepting. "God save the King," the congregation proclaimed in unison. The words echoed through the ancient building, powerful and final. William was no longer just William. He was the king. George felt something shift in that moment. That was his father up there, but also now his king. The dual reality of it crashed over him. His father would always be his father, but now he was also something more, something that belonged to an entire nation. Tears sprang to George's eyes. He tried to blink them away, not wanting to cry in front of all these people. But they came anyway, silent tears rolling down his young face. Charlotte saw her brother crying and felt her own tears rising. She had been fighting so hard to hold everything together, but seeing George cry broke something loose inside her. An eagle-eyed camera operator caught the moment. The image of the 2 children, tears streaming down their faces as their father became king, was beamed to every corner of the world. People everywhere stopped what they were doing to watch these children cry. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming emotion, of love, of pride, of the sheer magnitude of the moment washing over young hearts not quite ready to contain it all. In the control room, the producer, who was a mother, felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Those babies," she whispered. "They understand. They really understand what this means." Catherine saw her children crying and her heart broke and swelled simultaneously. She wanted to go to them, to hold them, to comfort them, but protocol demanded she stay in her position. All she could do was catch George's eye and mouth the words, "I love you." George nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Charlotte did the same. They were together in this overwhelming moment, and somehow that made it bearable. Louis, noticing his siblings crying, reached over and patted Charlotte's hand. His simple gesture of comfort from the youngest to his older sister made fresh tears flow. But these tears carried something beautiful in them. They carried love, family, unity. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion. William stood, crowned, transformed. He looked toward his children and saw their tear-stained faces. In that moment, he knew that his greatest achievement was not becoming king. It was being their father. The final prayers were spoken. The final hymns were sung. The ceremony that had taken years to plan was nearly complete. Soon they would process back out of the abbey, back into the world, forever changed by what had happened within these sacred walls. The organ music signaled the end of the ceremony. William turned to face the congregation. The crown now settled on his head, the weight of it no longer strange but part of him. His eyes immediately sought his children. George had stopped crying, but his face was still flushed. Charlotte had finally found some relief during the ceremony, when a sympathetic attendant discreetly helped her. And now she looked exhausted, but calmer. Louis was leaning heavily against his brother, fighting sleep after the long early morning and the extended ceremony. The procession out of the abbey began. This time, as the newly crowned king, William walked with different steps. More official. More final. Catherine walked beside him, her role now elevated as well. Behind them, the children fell into line, guided by gentle hands of royal attendants. The abbey doors opened, and once again the roar of the crowd crashed over them like a wave. But this time the sound was different, more joyful, more celebratory. The ceremony was complete. William was king. The family emerged into the daylight and the crowd erupted. The noise was deafening. Thousands of voices shouting, cheering, calling out congratulations. Flags waved frantically. Confetti filled the air, thrown by excited spectators. The carriage waited, even more ornate than the one that had brought them. The Golden State coach used only for coronations gleamed in the afternoon light. The horses stood ready, their handlers keeping them calm despite the chaos. George helped Charlotte into the carriage, playing the protective older brother. Louis climbed in with renewed energy, the excitement of the crowd waking him from his drowsiness. William and Catherine followed, settling into the plush seats. As the carriage began to move, something unexpected happened. The crowd started singing. It began in one section, then spread like wildfire through the masses. "God Save the King" rang out from thousands of throats, raw and emotional and completely unrehearsed. Inside the carriage, William felt the emotion of it hit him physically. His hand found Catherine's, gripping tightly. She squeezed back, her eyes also bright with unshed tears. "Father, why are they singing?" Louis asked, his young voice filled with wonder. "Because they are happy," William managed to say, his voice rough. "Because they believe in us. Because they hope." The procession route took them through the heart of London. Every street was packed with people. Every window held spectators. Every rooftop had been claimed by photographers and cameramen. The entire city had transformed into one massive celebration. In homes around the world, people watched the procession on their screens. In living rooms and hospitals, in schools and offices, in places where it was morning and places where it was midnight, humanity paused to witness this moment together. A teacher in Kenya used the coronation as a lesson for her students. She paused the broadcast on the image of the children in the carriage and asked her class what they saw. The students called out answers. They looked tired. They looked nervous. They looked like regular kids. "Exactly," the teacher said. "Remember this. No matter how important someone becomes, they are still human. They still feel what we all feel." The carriage passed through Trafalgar Square, where a massive crowd had gathered. Giant screens showed the procession, allowing people to see details they could not make out from ground level. When the cameras zoomed in on the children's faces, the crowd's cheers grew even louder. Charlotte looked out at all the people and felt overwhelmed again, but this time in a different way. These thousands of strangers were cheering for her family. They did not know her, had never met her, yet they cared. They were celebrating with them. George watched the crowds with growing understanding. He was beginning to grasp what his father had tried to explain earlier. These people needed something to believe in. In a world that often felt uncertain and divided, They wanted to see family, tradition, continuity. His family represented something larger than themselves. A photographer in the crowd captured a remarkable shot. Charlotte was waving at a small child being held up by their parent. The child, maybe 3 years old, waved back enthusiastically. In that image, two children connected across the barrier of protocol and position, just two kids seeing each other. That photograph would later appear on the cover of newspapers worldwide. The headline would read, "The Human Crown." People would study that image, seeing in it the essential truth that royalty, despite all its trappings, is still fundamentally about people. The carriage turned onto the mall, the final stretch before reaching the palace. This road was perhaps the most crowded of all. People had been camping here for days, staking out the best viewing positions. British flags mixed with flags from Commonwealth nations and beyond, creating a tapestry of international unity. An elderly veteran stood near the front of the crowd, his old uniform decorated with medals from wars long past. He saluted as the carriage passed, tears streaming down his weathered face. He had seen 4 monarchs in his lifetime. This 5th coronation would be his last. He wanted to remember every detail. Beside him, his great-granddaughter, barely 5 years old, waved a flag bigger than herself. She would remember this day for the rest of her life, though she would not understand its significance for many years. She would tell her own grandchildren about the day she saw the king crowned, about the excitement in the air, about feeling part of something momentous. The palace came into view, its familiar facade both a destination and a new beginning. The carriage slowed as it approached the gates. The crowd here was the most fervent, the most devoted. These were the people who had waited longest, slept on the streets, devoted themselves to being as close as possible to this moment. Louis pressed his face against the carriage window, waving with both hands at everyone he saw. His enthusiasm was infectious. People laughed and waved back, charmed by his genuine excitement. "Look at that little prince," a woman in the crowd said to her friend, wiping tears from her eyes. "He's just happy to be here. No airs, no pretension. Just a child enjoying the moment." The carriage passed through the palace gates and the family felt a collective exhale. They were home. The public part was almost over. Soon they would have a moment to themselves to decompress, to process everything that had happened. But first there was one more duty, the balcony appearance. The traditional moment when the newly crowned monarch presents themselves to the people gathered at the palace. Inside the palace, staff rushed to prepare them for this final public moment. The children were given water and small snacks. Charlotte was able to fully attend to her needs. George was offered a chance to sit and rest his feet. Louis was allowed to run around for a few minutes, burning off his excess energy. William removed the crown temporarily, feeling the relief as the weight lifted from his head. He rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. Catherine came to stand beside him, placing a cool hand on his cheek. "You did beautifully," she said softly. "We did beautifully," he corrected, "all of us together." Through the palace windows, they could hear the crowd outside chanting, "We want the king! We want the king." The voices were patient but insistent. The people had waited so long. They deserved this final moment. William looked at his children. George was drinking water gratefully, his formal jacket loosened. Charlotte was leaning against her mother, exhausted. Louis was examining one of his shoes, having discovered it was bothering him. "Are you ready for one more appearance?" William asked them. George straightened up immediately. "Yes, father." Charlotte nodded, though her fatigue was obvious. Louis looked up from his shoe. "Will there be more people?" "So many more people," Catherine said with a gentle smile. "Good," Louis declared. "I like waving." The family moved toward the balcony doors. Palace staff made final adjustments to their appearance. The crown was placed back on William's head. The children's clothes were straightened. Deep breaths were taken. Outside, the crowd's chanting grew louder, more insistent. The anticipation was building to a fever pitch. William took Catherine's hand. "Together," he said. "Together," she echoed. The doors to the balcony opened. The roar of the crowd was like standing at the base of a waterfall. The sound was physical, overwhelming, all-consuming. The family stepped out onto the balcony and the world exploded with joy. The crowd went wild, their cheers reaching a crescendo that seemed impossible to sustain, yet somehow grew even louder. Hundreds of thousands of people packed the area in front of the palace, stretching as far as the eye could see. George stepped forward first, and the crowd cheered specifically for him. Then Charlotte, receiving her own wave of adoration. Then Louis, whose appearance made people laugh and cheer with delight. Finally, William and Catherine, the king and his queen, standing before their people. The family waved, and the world waved back. In that moment, standing together on that historic balcony, they were not just symbols or figures. They were a family, and their love for each other, visible and genuine, moved the hearts of millions watching around the globe. The balcony doors finally closed behind them, shutting out the roar of the crowd. The sudden quiet felt unnatural after hours of constant noise. William removed the crown and set it carefully on a nearby table. His head ached from its weight. Charlotte collapsed onto the nearest sofa, not caring that her beautiful dress would wrinkle. George sat down more carefully beside her, maintaining some composure even in private. Louis kicked off the shoe that had been bothering him and ran in circles around the room, releasing all the energy he had been forced to contain. Catherine knelt down and removed her own uncomfortable formal shoes with a sigh of relief. "Those are instruments of torture," she declared, making the children giggle. William joined his family, sitting on the floor despite his formal robes. The informality of it, the king sitting on the carpet, would have shocked the formal palace staff. But in this private moment, he was just a tired father who needed to be close to his children. "You were all magnificent," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know today was hard. I know it was scary and uncomfortable and overwhelming. But you did it. You were there for me, and I will never forget that." George looked at his father, the crown now resting on the table behind him. "Father, do you feel different now that you are king?" William considered the question seriously. "Yes and no. The title is different. The responsibilities are greater, but I am still me, still your father, still the man who makes terrible jokes and burns toast and worries about you constantly." "You do make terrible jokes," Charlotte agreed, smiling for the first time in hours. "The worst," George added. Grinning. "Awful," Louis contributed, not wanting to be left out. Catherine laughed, and the sound filled the room with warmth. This was what they needed. Not ceremony or formality, but laughter and love and the simple comfort of being together. Beyond the palace walls, the world was processing what they had witnessed. Social media exploded with posts, photographs, and videos from the coronation. But the images that spread most rapidly were those of the children. George crying during the ceremony became an image shared millions of times. People added captions expressing their own emotions. "This is what love looks like." A boy watching his father become history. The weight of a crown seen through young eyes. Charlotte's moment of discomfort, caught by observant cameras, sparked a global conversation about the pressure placed on children in the public eye. Parents everywhere related to watching a child struggle and being unable to help immediately. Louis waving spontaneously became an instant meme, but a loving one. His genuine enthusiasm and lack of pretension won hearts worldwide. Artists created illustrations inspired by the moment. Children in dozens of countries imitated his enthusiastic wave. In a coffee shop in Seattle, a group of friends gathered around a laptop, rewatching key moments from the ceremony. They paused on the image of all three children crying. "Look at them," one woman said, her own eyes watering. "They understand what it means. They are so young, but they get it." "My daughter is George's age," another friend replied. "I cannot imagine putting her through something like that." But they handled it with such grace. In Mumbai, a family gathered for dinner with the coronation playing on the television. The grandmother, who had lived through significant historical changes in her own country, watched the British ceremony with keen interest. "Look at how the father includes his children," she observed to her family. "He does not hide them away. He brings them into his world. That is the sign of changing times." Her grandson, a teenager typically more interested in video games than royal ceremonies, found himself genuinely moved. "They look like they really love each other," he said, sounding surprised. "Not just for show." "Like really?" "That is because it is real," his grandmother replied. "You cannot fake that kind of love. It shows in every gesture, every glance." In the palace staff began bringing in trays of food. The family had eaten barely anything all day, and now they were ravenous. Formal dietary protocols were abandoned in favor of comfort food. Sandwiches, fruit, cakes, and sweets filled the table. Louis attacked the food with enthusiasm, making everyone laugh with his single-minded focus. Charlotte ate more slowly, her body still recovering from the stress of the day. George tried to maintain dignity even while eating, then gave up and just enjoyed the food. William's private secretary entered quietly, carrying a tablet. "Your Majesty, I thought you might want to see some of the early reactions." William took the tablet hesitantly. Part of him did not want to know what people were saying, but curiosity won out. He began scrolling through news headlines and social media posts. His eyes widened as he read. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, but more than that, it was personal. People were not just reporting on a ceremony. They were sharing how the coronation had moved them, how seeing his family had touched their hearts. "Catherine, look at this," he said, handing her the tablet. She read silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to deep emotion. "William, they understand. They see what we hoped they would see." "What do they see?" George asked, curious. Catherine showed him some of the posts. Messages from parents saying they hugged their own children tighter after watching the ceremony. From people who said seeing the family's love reminded them what truly matters. From those who praised the children's bravery and authenticity. George read in silence, his young face serious. "They really were watching us that closely?" "Every moment," William confirmed. But George, they did not see weakness or mistakes. They saw courage. They saw real children being brave in an overwhelming situation. "That is powerful." A message came through from William's father, who had watched the ceremony from elsewhere in the palace. Could he come see them? William immediately agreed. The former king entered the room, no longer wearing his ceremonial robes but simple, comfortable clothes. He looked at the scene before him, the new king sitting on the floor with his family, eating sandwiches and laughing, and his eyes filled with tears again. "Father, are you all right?" William asked, standing quickly. "More than all right," the older man said. "I am perfect, because I am watching you be the father and the king I always hoped you would be." He joined them on the floor, his old knees protesting but his spirit willing. Louis immediately climbed into his grandfather's lap, offering him a partially eaten sandwich. The gesture was so innocent, so genuine, that it made everyone laugh. "Today was extraordinary," William's father said. "Not because of the ceremony itself, though it was beautiful, but because of what I saw on that balcony. I saw a family united. I saw love made visible. That is more powerful than any crown." Charlotte, emboldened by the informal atmosphere, asked the question she had been holding inside all day. "Grandfather, were you scared when you became king?" He considered his answer carefully, looking into her young, honest eyes. "Terrified," he admitted. "Absolutely terrified. I felt too young, too unprepared, too human for such a divine responsibility." "How did you do it then?" she asked. "I remembered that being human is not a weakness. It is a strength. People do not need a king who is perfect and distant. They need a king who understands their struggles, their hopes, their humanity. Your father understands that. And you children, by being yourselves today, you showed the world that royalty is not about being above people. It is about being with people." His words settled over the room like a benediction. Even Louis stopped eating to listen, sensing the importance of what was being said. Outside, the evening was settling over London. The crowds were beginning to disperse, though many still lingered, not wanting the day to end. Street cleaners began the massive task of cleaning up after the celebration. Vendors counted their earnings from selling flags and memorabilia. In a small flat overlooking the mall, an elderly woman sat at her window, looking down at the remnants of the celebration. She had watched the entire coronation from this window, too frail to join the crowds below, but she had seen it all, and more importantly, she had felt it all. She thought about the little girl she had seen crying in the abbey. She thought about the boy trying so hard to be brave. She thought about the youngest one waving with such joy, and she thought about the parents, guiding them through it all with visible love. She picked up her phone and called her own granddaughter, who lived in another city. "Did you watch?" she asked when the call connected. "Every minute, Gran," her granddaughter replied. "I cried 3 times, and me too, dear." "Me too. Do you know why?" "Because it was beautiful." "Because it was real," the old woman corrected gently. "Because in a world that often feels false and staged, we watched something genuine. We watched a family love each other despite the pressure, despite the cameras, despite everything. That is rare. That is precious." Back in the palace, the family's private moment was drawing to a close. There would be more obligations soon, more appearances, more responsibilities. But for now they had this. William looked at each of his children, then at Catherine, then at his father. His family, spanning 3 generations, sitting together on the floor of a palace room, eating sandwiches and sharing love. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you all for being here, for being you, for making today not just bearable but meaningful." George stood and walked to his father, hugging him tightly. Charlotte joined them. "Louise." 3 weeks had passed since the coronation, but the world had not stopped talking about it. The photographs, especially those of the children, continued to circulate. Articles analyzed every moment, every gesture, every expression. But within the palace walls, life was finding a new rhythm. George sat at his desk, attempting to focus on his homework. Mathematics problems stared back at him from the page, but his mind kept wandering. His teacher had been more patient with him since the coronation, understanding that adjusting to his father being king was no small thing. Through his window, he could see tourists gathered at the palace gates, phones raised, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. It was always like this now, more intense than before. The coronation had renewed public interest in the family, especially in him and his siblings. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Charlotte entered without waiting for permission, something she had been doing more often lately. The coronation had changed something between them, bonded them in a way only shared experience can. "Are you thinking about it again?" she asked, sitting on his bed. "How did you know?" George replied. "Because I am too. I think about it every day." George put down his pencil and turned to face his sister. "Does it feel strange to you? How much attention we got? People are still sharing those photos of us crying." Charlotte nodded. "Mother showed me some of the messages people wrote. They were not making fun of us. They were saying we were brave." "But we were not brave," George said quietly. "We were scared. Maybe brave means doing something even when you are scared," Charlotte suggested, repeating words their father had told them. In another part of the palace, Louis was having his afternoon snack, chattering away to the nanny about his day at school. His classmates had been asking him endless questions about the coronation. At 5 years old, he understood the day had been special, but he could not quite grasp why everyone was still talking about it. "The teacher said I was on the news in other countries," Louis announced between bites of his apple. "She showed me on the computer. There were words in languages I could not read, but there was my picture." The nanny smiled at his enthusiasm. Of the 3 children, Louis had been least affected by the pressure of that day. His innocence had been a shield, protecting him from the weight his older siblings felt. William found Catherine in their private sitting room, reviewing her schedule for the coming weeks. The demands on their time had increased exponentially since the coronation. Everyone wanted appearances, speeches, engagements. "We need to talk about the children," William said, sitting beside her. Catherine looked up from her papers. "I have been thinking the same thing. George is struggling, isn't he? He puts so much pressure on himself. He thinks because he is the oldest, because he will someday be king himself, he has to be perfect." "He is 10 years old," Catherine said, her voice tight with emotion. "He should be worrying about school projects and football matches, not the weight of a future crown." William took her hand. "The coronation changed things, we knew it would, but I did not expect the level of focus on them. Those photographs of them crying have been everywhere." "I know," Catherine said. "But William, I have been reading what people are saying. They are not criticizing. They are praising. They are saying our children showed them that it is okay to feel emotions, that vulnerability is not weakness. But should they have to carry that message? Should their tears be public property? It was the question that had been haunting William for weeks. Yes, the reaction had been positive. Yes, people had been moved and inspired. But at what cost to his children's privacy, their innocence? That evening, the family gathered for dinner, a rare occasion when no public duties interfered. The children seemed more relaxed in this private setting, away from the watchful eyes of staff and public. "Father," George said during the meal, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Always," William replied. "Do you ever regret it?" letting us be part of the coronation, with all the attention we have gotten? William set down his fork, giving his son his full attention. This was an important question, deserving an honest answer. I have questioned it, he admitted. I have worried that we exposed you to too much too soon. But George, do you regret being there? George thought for a long moment. No, he finally said. It was hard, it was scary. But I was with you. We were together, I would not change that. Me neither, Charlotte added softly. Me three, Louis announced, though he was not entirely sure what they were talking about. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. That is exactly why we did it. Not for the world to see, but so you would know that in the most important moments of our lives, we are together. But the crying, George continued, still working through his feelings. Everyone saw us cry. Kids at school asked me about it. They wanted to know why I was crying. What did you tell them? William asked gently. I told them I was crying because I was proud of you. Because I love you. Because watching you become king made me feel so many things I could not hold them all inside. William stood and walked around the table to embrace his son. That is perfect. That is exactly right. Never be ashamed of those tears, George. They were honest. They were real. In a world that often values appearances over truth, you showed everyone that real emotions matter. Later that night, after the children were in bed, William stood in his study looking at a framed photograph. It was the one that had gone viral, showing him reaching for Charlotte's hand in the carriage. A professional photographer had sent them a print, and William had immediately had it framed. Catherine joined him looking at the image. That is my favorite photo from the entire day. Mine too, William agreed. Not the official portraits, not the moment of crowning, but this moment of being a father first. The photographer won an award for this image, Catherine told him. I read about it today. He said he has photographed hundreds of royal events, but this was the first time he cried while working. He said he was witnessing something he had never seen before, genuine love unguarded by protocol. William studied the photograph more closely. He could see Charlotte's fear, his own concern, the intimacy of a parent comforting a child. The palace advisors were worried about having the children so visible, he remembered. They said it was risky. The children are unpredictable. They were right, Catherine said with a slight smile. The children were unpredictable, but that unpredictability, that authenticity, is exactly what made the day so powerful. Across the ocean, the impact of the coronation continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. A therapist in New York began using the image of George crying as a tool in her practice, helping young boys understand that expressing emotions was healthy and normal. Even a future king cries, she would tell her clients. Even someone who will have enormous responsibility and power knows that showing emotion is not weakness. In a small village in Ghana, a teacher printed out the photographs of the royal children and hung them in her classroom. When her students asked why, she explained that these children reminded her of them. Look at their faces, she said. They are nervous but brave. They are scared, but they do it anyway. That is how you should approach every difficult thing in your life. Feel the fear, but move forward with love. In Australia, a father showed his daughter the video of Charlotte struggling during the ceremony. His daughter had been bullied at school for having a bathroom accident during a test. She felt ashamed, broken, mortified. Look at this princess, her father said gently. She was uncomfortable during one of the most important ceremonies in the world. Millions were watching, but she got through it. And you know what? People did not mock her. They admired her strength. The girl watched the video with tears in her eyes. Did she really have to go to the bathroom during the coronation? She really did. And it was hard. But she was brave. Just like you were brave during your test. Just like you are brave every day. Back at the palace, George lay in bed, unable to sleep. He thought about the coronation, about the months ahead, about the life that stretched before him. It felt overwhelming sometimes, the knowledge that one day he would wear that same crown. A soft knock came at his door. Come in, he called. William entered, still dressed formally from an evening event. He had checked on his children before retiring, as he did every night, and had noticed George's light still on. "Cannot sleep?" William asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I keep thinking about the future," George admitted, "about when I will have to do what you did." "That is many, many years away," William reminded him gently. "But it will happen, and I am scared." William was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Let me tell you a secret. I am still scared. Every day. The crown does not make the fear go away. But you know what helps?" "What?" "Remembering that day, when you and Charlotte and Louis were beside me, when our family was together. That memory gives me strength when things are difficult. When I feel overwhelmed, I think of you three, and I remember why I am doing this." "Really?" George asked, surprised. "Really? You think you need to be strong for me, but the truth is, you make me strong. Your presence, your love, your willingness to stand with me even when you were scared, that was the greatest gift you could have given me." George sat up and hugged his father tightly. "I love you, Father.